Alright friends, about 2 weeks ago the PTR patch notes got released and there was a lot of response, there was a lot of feedback, there were some hard-hitting criticisms. And I thought it would be fun to address it in a video. Now, I've seen everything on the Battle.net forums, on Twitter, people messaging me on Battle.net calling me an idiot. But I thought the place where everyone is the most reasonable, the greatest place on the internet, has to be Reddit. So we're going to be going over some Reddit threads, some Reddit comments, see what they have to say, see if the criticisms are legit, and I'll respond to them and see, if I can answer any hard-hitting questions here. We'll start by just seeing how all the different races perceived this patch, starting with all things Protoss. Beautiful banner here, my face is in it apparently. And this was the announcement 15 days ago, exactly. StarCraft 2 5.0 PTR patch notes. The first comment, most upvoted. Why not just remove Protoss from the game and hand the trophy to Maru or Rogue in a coin flip? As a player since 2011 or before, this is a shameful end to StarCraft 2. It's a big middle finger to any and all Protoss players. So, they're taking it quite rough here. I just realized lurkers escape without a single nerf. Here's someone that says, another year of Oracle Stargate openers and Blink Stalkers. Clown emoji. Don't think he's too happy with that. Wanted some different openers as well. So we're just screwed when Terran does a 2-base push now with the overcharge nerf, or am I missing something? This is actually a good question. So the battery nerf is definitely significant. The overcharge battery, but I don't believe that it necessarily is going to mean that we'll lose to every single 2-base push. Maybe the 3-Rex pushes will be a little bit stronger, and especially if you're defending with Colossi, this will change the defense. But if you're trying to defend with like a charged Stalker type of setup, I don't think too much is going to change personally, but I could be wrong there. Alright, let's move over quickly to all things Zerg. Makes me so happy to see the salty tosses and Terrans in the main subreddit. They're so salty, we finally got a buff to our useless units. They've been getting buffs for years, but now that we get them, they start crying Zerg OP instantly. Good thing none of them can influence the balance patch, as it was made by people who do know how the game works. Finally, we will have good Hydras and Ultras, and Toss and Terran tiers are just an added bonus on top of that. For the Swarm. Now, this is I feel like if Protoss perceives it as the worst patch ever and Zergs perceive it as the best patch ever, there probably is going to be some truth to that. And the changes probably are slightly more Zerg favored than Toss favored. Then we move over to, to Terran. With the major changes including carrier nerf, Ravenwork, blah blah blah. I think this is just more talking about what happened, and the first comment is, finally, that's what we needed. Toss' ability to hug battery in early game was just irritating, and it always gives them time until AoE units show to fully deflect early push. Toss will need to invest more to deflect 3-Rex Terran pushes. This is an interesting point, and I kind of touched on it earlier, but I'm not entirely sure what type of 3-Rex Terran pushers are being meant there. So you have two types of 3-Rex Terran pushers. The first one is just a straight up 3-Rex. So your first building is a barracks, your second building is a barracks, and your third building is a barracks. That would be called a 3-Rex. But another thing that could be considered a 3-Rex push would be a barracks factory into starport opener, then adding 2 more barracks, getting stim and combat shield, and hitting around 645 with your first 2 medevacs. I think against both of these, Toss will now need to invest more to defend, but especially some of these earlier pushes with a lot of units, like a straight up 3-Rex or even a straight up 1-1-1, will definitely be a little bit harder to hold for Protoss. I completely agree with that, and I think that is something that is probably a little bit wanted as well. I don't think that is necessarily a bad thing. The later on pushes, once again, if you're playing a Stalker Zealot composition with charge, you're going to be fighting away from your super battery quite often anyway. It's not going to be that huge of a deal. If you're trying to defend with Colossus, I personally believe that this patch is actually going to be better for you due to the Raven rework, but we might get to that a little bit later. So I'm not even entirely on board here necessarily with Mysterious Lab 1634. So now that we know that how it has been received by all three races, so we had Protoss very upset, Zerg extremely happy, and Terran seems to be somewhat okay with it. This seems like a great balance patch for Terran players. Yeah, okay, they're also pretty happy. Seems like Protoss got nerfed the most, and then Terran and Zerg some buffs. Now, then I saw this post, which was made by Huzur38, 12 days ago. And here, Huzur does something that I truly did enjoy, because he gives specific criticisms on different things, rather than just saying everyone that participated in this balance patch is a complete idiot. He pointed out specific things that he had issues with, and we'll just go through them point by point. Starting with Zerg, the creep tumor. As pointed out by many comments prior, the cooldown optimization doesn't exist, even at the pro level. The cooldown increased from 11 to 13 doesn't make real impact in the actual game. Division reduction is an okay nerf. Now, I've actually heard this argument a lot, and I think this stems from when Hero Marine went into replays of Solar and Serral on his stream, and he checked how fast they would spread their creep tumors. And very often, both Solar and Serral wouldn't be hitting them exactly on cooldown. So, as a result, everyone said, well, these 2 seconds don't matter at all. It is not even a real nerf, because they never make it in time anyway. And to these people, I would ask, so in that scenario, would you be okay with the cooldown being decreased from 11 to 5 seconds? Because a lot of people say, well, they only look at it every 15 seconds anyway, so if the cooldown is basically non-existent at 5 seconds, that really shouldn't impact anything. And then they'd come out of the woodwork and say, no, that's not quite what we want either, because that sounds really broken. Well, like, you have to pick one or the other. You can't have it both ways. And I think this change, although it is quite small, it is definitely going to impact games where not a lot happens in the first 4 or 5 minutes. In TVZ, that scenario could, for example, be a 2-1-1 push out of Terran after 2 Hellions, or just a straight up 2-1-1 push from a command center first, in which not a lot happens. Usually, the ability to spread creep would be, well, every 11 seconds, and Zerg could pretty much hit that on cooldown. Same in a PVZ, where nothing happens in the first 5 minutes in certain build orders. Perhaps Zerg would also be capable of doing that, and here it's just gonna be made a little bit harder. Like, it's not a huge nerf, but it is still a nerf, and people pretending that it isn't a nerf, actually, it makes no sense. Because if it's not a nerf at all, they also, you know, if you buff it the other way, then that also technically shouldn't be a buff. But then if you would suggest that, they would start complaining about it a lot, and yeah, it's just very frustrating when it happens, that type of complaints. Now, second one, the Ultralisk. I think it's a step in the right direction, and the units are much less derpy now. However, I feel like the range slop is a bit overkill, since the small Ultralisk are already fast off creep. The ability to allow other races, mainly Bio, to kite back shouldn't be touched too much. I agree with the size reduction, but the range slop is unnecessary given how they can reach the target much better now. I think this is very fair criticism. Basically, you're making it easier for the Ultralisk to already attack the unit. Why do you also want the range slop? So basically the range at which the melee attack still hits. Why do you also want that to be increased? It is basically a double buff. And this is something that just needs to be tested, right? Like, it is still PTR, and even if it goes into the game and if things are obviously broken, there is the ability to make some fixes in it, I do believe. So yeah, this is definitely something that everyone should keep in mind. And this is a very fair point of criticism. Double buffs can be kind of scary, can make units broken way quicker than you would imagine. Same thing with the Hydralisk, I guess. The movement speed is nice, but it's weird to see they move at the 4.2 instead of 4.13 like all other units. I think 4.13 should be the baseline for them. Okay, well, so just wants a slight reduction in the actual speed buff. Broodlords, well, Broodlings are much less spammy. They are still good in the fight. When combined with the Broodlord's movement speed increase, I think it's a bit stronger than the combination was intended to. Either reducing the time span a bit more, readjust Broodlord's movement speed, or adjust the units used in the composition around Broodlords. Once again, this is something I completely agree with. It's going to be a lot easier with Broodlords to kite, but it should also be easier for other units to kind of get underneath it. Maybe the Broodlings are still there for too long, and maybe that timer should run out quicker. Maybe there shouldn't be a timer at all, and have more like a Guardian-like attack, where you just shoot, and there's no Broodling there to block movement at all. You can actually meaningfully kite as well with Broods. Yeah, I think it's very good to explore all of those options. I really like the thought. In general, I think Huzur38 did a good job with his criticisms. Now, next up, overall Zerg's mid-game is stronger, and I don't necessarily hate it, but some number is a bit off, and unnecessarily, especially when combined with many changes all at once instead of one. Yeah, this is also very true. The thing is that the last time the community balanced team just made like very little changes really to kind of mess with the balance and try to get the numbers a little bit better, and also in general just to make the gameplay a bit better. Now I think this is more of a different type of gameplay patch, where it's like, hey, we actually want to switch stuff up, make sure that multiple unit compositions are capable of being played, and that's why a lot is being changed. And some things will need to be reverted, some things are going to be maybe slightly too good or slightly too bad, but luckily there are some tests happening. I think there's a test tournament being run by Wardy as well, so yeah, the issues, like very obvious issues, should come forward in that period and can still be changed before the patch actually goes live. Okay, I don't have specific ideas about this because I agree with many parts. The change on carriers makes it a low-level friendly, and disruptors are less devastating. I wish Colossi to have 12 to 13 sight range, considering they are super tall and vulnerable to anti-air attacks, so giving them the ability to see further than most units makes them less vulnerable to flanking. I guess that is an okay point. I'm not yeah, I mean that is possible. You could give them a little bit more range. I'm not a huge fan of the change personally. Most of the time they're going to be very far back in the army, so checking stuff in front is not going to be super important with Colossi. And I don't think you want to have a unit that can just spot flanks all the time. 13 range might be a little bit too far. I think if you want to stop flanks, you need to have other types of vision. And I don't think creating a unit that has a lot more vision than other units is necessarily the way to go there. But once again, I think these are all very fair suggestions here out of Huzur 38. Something about the Cyclone. I'm honestly, I read this. I'm not going to comment on that because Cyclone is completely useless in my matchup. It also seems very useless in TVZ. I just have too little understanding of the Cyclone as a unit to really say what I think about this change, because I'm just not sure. I don't know. So yeah, we'll just skip that. Comes to the Ghost, I understand the point of the change to not force Zerg into a fight, because retreating is a death sentence since Snipe has no range limit. However, 13.5 range is a bit too stretchy. Even so many things of creep can run away from the Snipe, despite they came into poke and ran backward. No punishment for overextending. The range limit should be around 14.5 to 15 to allow the full retreat to still be an option, but not too short to be unable to counter the overextended targets. Now, this is actually a really interesting thing to say, and I believe that he is right in his analysis of the situation, is that right now, if you have a slight overextension of the Zerg army in the current PTR nodes, you will be capable of moving outside of snipe range with a lot of those units, which means that a small amount of units are going to die. But I think this is an interaction that I really like in StarCraft 2. I think it's like the moment you overextend into a position, even if it is just for a couple of seconds, I don't think should be game ending. It is not game ending for Terran when that happens most of the time. It's not game ending when that happens to TOS most of the time. And I don't think it should be for Zerg either in the ZVT matchup. I think mechanics that force a game to end the moment you slightly overextend tend to promote slower gameplay. It makes people less likely to engage, because every engagement is a fight that needs to go immediately. A good example here, for example, is the siege tank in TVP. If a Protoss moves into 3 siege tanks, it will cost him a little bit, his units will be damaged, but it doesn't straight up end the game. It just, you get some damage. However, if a Zerg moves incorrectly into a Terran army, realizes it can fight there, and then moves out of it, it's just going to get sniped to death completely. And there's very little other situations in the game that I can think of where units just get killed instantly. The only instances are with spellcasters that move in range somewhere. So imagine a Viper moves too close to a Protoss army, it gets feedbacked. Same with an Infestor, it can get feedbacked. I think these are fine because it's a small portion of the army that is going to basically die, or is going to get disabled in this case by the feedback. So I think this is something that we would want less of in the game rather than more. I think it's good that people, after trying to go for an engagement, they take a small loss and then move out of the range of certain units. I could be wrong there. I think this is more like a taste of how you think the game should go. For example, the way that Fungal works, in the PvZ matchup and sometimes in the TvZ matchup is also something I am not super fond of. The fact that if you get fungled on your Tempest is that a lot of your Tempests most likely are going to end up dying to Corruptors. Or if you get a fungal on your Ghost, these Ghosts most likely are going to get killed by the Banelings as a result. And there's very little counterplay anymore at that point. I think we want less of these interactions rather than more. And I think the Ghost versus Zerg interaction was one of the most... it was one of the worst interactions that we had when it came to that. So I disagree there with the Reddit poster here. But yeah, the analysis is spot on. Ravens. I like the rework since I feel like they have the possibility to appear more often in other matchups outside of TvT. What I don't like is the auto turret energy cost. 75 energy is too high for the ability that doesn't get any change. The turret should be stronger in some ways, be HP, duration or DPS, not ideal. It's also fine to return it back to 50 energy, but make the ability last shorter, from 10 seconds to 7 to 8. So this is interesting, and I don't really agree with it. I think a lot of Terran players actually kind of wanted the auto turret to be nerfed because it was so strong in TvT. And it kind of made the matchup less fun to play. Like everything basically revolves around the Raven, or that's what I heard in the early game. Once again, I'm not a Terran, I'm not a TvT player, so hearsay. When it comes to PvT, the auto turret is, it just costs slightly more energy, but you also start with more energy. So for the people that forgot, let's just have a quick look at the Raven rework over here. The gas cost has been reduced, the build time has been reduced, the starting energy increased, and the auto turret energy has also been increased. So basically when it comes to just purely the auto turret, it's going to have a very similar role still in TvP as it always has had before. Usually you see 1 to 3 turrets being used by a Raven, and I still think that's going to be the case, before it dies, that is. Because, well, you just get it 13 seconds faster, it is slightly cheaper, and the starting energy is the same. So you get a little bit more energy initially, you have 13 extra seconds of energy gathering, and so I think your second turret is going to be pretty much at the same time as usually your second turret would be. I don't think it is much of a nerf to the auto turret in how it currently interacts with Protoss. I don't think it's much of a nerf with how the auto turret currently interacts with Zerg either. I think it's a nerf to it mainly in TvT. In some ways, both in the TvP matchup and the TvZ matchup, I actually believe that the Raven is now easier to build for Terran. It builds a lot faster, which means that annoying things that you could accidentally die against, like DTs, are going to be less frustrating. You can almost get it as a reaction to them, although not quite most likely. Your tech lab is going to be available a lot quicker as well, which is great. The gas cost reduction is absolutely huge for Terran build orders. Terrans are extremely lacking in gas in the early game in TvP, and this is a great change. And it also perhaps could introduce the possibility of Banshee into Raven builds in the TvZ matchup, where you see one Banshee without cloak into a Raven. This could be something that happens due to the lower gas cost of the Raven and the higher speed at which it gets built. Yes, there is still a nerf to the anti-armor missile and a nerf to the interference matrix, which I think is cool. I never really liked interference matrix very much. It felt like it either was way too strong or too weak. It had like a really big power spike when there was only 1 or 2 big Protoss units, and the moment Protoss has a big enough army, it feels practically completely useless. I'm not a huge fan of this spell altogether. I think anti-armor missile, the reduction from 3 to 2 is also fair. I think -3 armor is absolutely insane. I think it is still one of the most underused abilities in the entire game. It is literally as good as Guardian Shield, if not better. One of the only reasons we don't see it is because most Terrans don't want to have a separate control group for Ravens for whatever reason. So they always just fly them forward with their Bioforce, which is one of these things in StarCraft 2 I just don't understand. Anti-armor missile is legitimately one of the best spells in the entire game. And even with this reduction from 3 to 2, -2 armor is still absolutely huge. I don't understand it. Alright, for Terran, I'm worried about the mid-game in TvZ, because Ultralisk and Hydras become better in that stage. While I like most of the changes here, some numbers might be adjusted. I think this is some of the fairest criticism that I've seen, although I don't agree with every outcome. I think most of the analysis was pretty alright. yeah, this is definitely something we need to keep in mind, is that Hydralisks have been buffed against TOS, but also against Terran, and they already were pretty much a mainstay against Terran. I think that's one of the scariest changes, is that the Hydralisk just becomes way too powerful in the mid-game. On the other hand, I don't think it's necessarily bad that Zerg has a mid-game unit that could potentially actually kill Terran players. Too many games in TVZ are Zerg winning the early game in a major way, and then Terran staying alive with tanks, and then eventually teching into Ghost. I like the thought of being capable of dying if you're really far behind in a certain stage of the game. Next. Now we get to the slightly less reasonable criticism. Public service announcement. Being good at a game does not equal being a good game designer. This should be pretty obvious, but Discord around the proposed balance changes suggests otherwise. I mean, I completely agree that if you're good at a game, it doesn't mean you're a good game designer. But I do believe in order to be to have valuable input on a game that is as old as StarCraft 2, I think you need to understand the game at a very high level at least, which means that the pool of people that could potentially be good balance designers as well as game designers, I guess here he only mentions game designers, but in order to keep the balance somewhat okay, I think you definitely are going to need the input of someone that is very high level, and ideally also someone that understands what good game design is. I find that pros are pretty good at identifying which units are strong and weak in the current metagame and why. Anything beyond a numbers change, though, doesn't really seem to garner serious consideration. They've sunk a ton of hours into the existing gameplay and tend to be comfortable with it as is, whether they admit it or not. Major changes aren't really what they are looking for. Now, this is something that I also see repeated a lot, and here I'm going to, they say whether they admit it or not. I personally am a huge fan of changing things up in a big way, and I think a lot of professionals would love to change things up in a big way as well. The problem is that we don't have a dictator set up here. It's a lot easier to have big changes if there's one guy at the top going, hey, we're going to do this, we're going to do this, we're going to do that. And that is how it is. Like it used to be with the old balance teams. Right now, because you have a considerably larger group of people, you need to reach some type of compromise, which always is going to kind of water down the changes, and it's going to be a little bit more give and take. Perhaps not the most optimal approach, but in my mind, the best approach we currently have given the situation. It is really difficult. The problem is you can't really do large overhauls of the game this way, even if the end result is far better than what we start out with. I also kind of agree with this. I just think it's not true that a lot of people don't want to change. I think a lot of pro gamers want major change because we understand that major change also represents an interest from viewers and an interest from the community, and maybe new people will be, or old people will be more interested in the game again. And we obviously want StarCraft to stay alive for as long as possible because, well, most of us, it's our career, quit university for it. Like, if we can play StarCraft for longer, that's obviously good for us. Like, we always have that in our best interest as well. But yeah. I think a good points out of Into the Rain as well. But I really believe a lot of pros would like major changes. Next, a balance idea is remove rapid fire entirely. What would be the negative effects of removing rapid fire ability from the game? It would most significantly reduce creep spread, but it would make spreading creep more skills based. Spamming auto turrets and bios would become more skill based. The only major annoyance would be Protoss warping in units. This is definitely a Protoss player, and I applaud you for coming here, my friends. 0 upvotes, but 17 comments, then you know it's a good thread. And for the people that don't really know what the rapid fire ability is, I can quickly show it here in game. That should be no problem. So basically, the way that rapid fire works is that, imagine that I want to warp in Stalkers. Usually you have to press the S button, the hotkey for Stalker, and then you left click, right? This is how you were to usually warp in. Now, it's fast, but it could be a lot faster with rapid fire as we wait for the cooldown. Basically what rapid fire does, it left clicks with a hotkey. So in this case, that's going to be the hotkey S, and I also have it set for H and for the Z button, which means I can warp in extremely fast. And you could do the same thing with creep spread. So rather than having to click every single time individually, you can just go like this. So I didn't click once, I just basically dragged my mouse, and then whenever it saw a spot available for the Stalker, it warped it. And you can do the same with creep spread. You can do the same with, I think they also use it for snipe. Terrans use it for snipe on the ghost. I actually believe that would be the most meaningful change. It would be a huge nerf to snipe for Terran. So I don't think it's necessarily a great suggestion to completely remove rapid fire, as it really impacts gameplay, and I also think it would kind of mess with people's wrist because they would need to click a crap ton more. It's kind of boring, repetitive actions most of the time. I don't know. It's a bigger balance change than you would think initially. So yeah, I can't quite oversee the consequences of that. But interesting thought. Don't mind it completely. Golden Jiggy. Next. What do we have here? The new purpose balance changes are amazing. Could be perfect with one more set of changes. And that is making spellcasters easier to use by giving them a very weak ranged auto attack like the High Templar got a while back. Now, this is actually an interesting one. I thought about this a lot as well, where it's like, well, we got it for the Templar, and the Terran spellcaster in the Ghost also has it. But do we want that for air units? I was thinking, like, for... Not really, right? I mean, I don't want that on an Oracle, which is technically also a spellcaster. I don't want that for a Viper. The one unit I wouldn't mind it on is the Infestor, because I feel like the Infestor is one of the only ground spellcasters that doesn't have it right now. I might be forgetting something, but I guess the Disruptor is not really a spellcaster, but kind of a spellcaster, also doesn't have it. I don't know. I'm not a huge fan of doing the same thing everywhere. I think in the comments, people, either add it for all or remove for all. I don't necessarily agree with this. It is a game that, I don't know. We shouldn't make everything the same. There needs to be something unique about the races. So I wasn't a fan when they introduced it for the Templar, simply because I use a separate control group for my Templar as well, so I didn't see the purpose as much. I don't A-move my Templar group either, so it's only really useful for lower level play. I think it still would be the case with Infestors as well, so I don't know. I'm not entirely opposed to doing it for ground spellcasters. So that would be adding the Infestor or removing it on the... But then you also need to add the Disruptor. I think that would be ridiculous. Nah, I'm not a fan of it. We keep it as is. Fight me in the comments. Next. My thoughts on Protoss and balance. I've played all expansions and I'm a Diamond Protoss. As I sit and watch Home Story Ka, I have a few thoughts concerning Protoss. Does Protoss seem like the least balanced race? What I mean is not to say that they are good or too bad altogether. I mean it often looks like TOS is either getting steamrolled or wrecking with an epic late game composition. I feel like contrarily Terran and Zerg are more well rounded from the start to finish of a game, or so it often looks to me, both with inexpensive and efficient units and decent comeback potential. I feel like due to the expensive and extreme nature of TOS units, the entire race seems too all or nothing to me. Stalkers are either wrecking with some kind of blink timing or getting wrecked by bio. Blah 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 blah. As I want to mention, the Disruptor, which seems to be the biggest example of what I'm talking about. It either sends in its AoE and wrecks a group of units, which is epic to watch, or misses entirely and then proceeds to stand around and look dumb as a tier 3 unit. I know that occasionally it's used for zoning, but still, that isn't always the case. What I'm saying is, it just looks like, if anything, the Protoss looks like it could use a redesign to make it more rounded like Terran and Zerg. Interesting thought. I like the example of the Disruptor here. And yeah, I mean, if you're not hitting your Disruptor shots, you're most likely going to lose the game. But I think that's the case with most major spells. It's just that the Disruptor might be a little bit harder to hit than other spells. So if you think of an EMP is instant and deals a lot of damage. So it's going to be very likely that it's going to connect, right? It's the same with a fungal. It's practically instant. There is a little bit of an animation, but it's very, very fast. Storm deals a lot of damage, and you almost always hit it if you click on the correct spot. So I think the Disruptor is a good example of that. It also does feel sometimes like Protoss is lacking a bit of a backbone of the army, if that makes any sense. You either hit your spells or you don't at all. But then again, with Zergs, if your Banelings don't connect with units, you also look absolutely terrible. Yeah, it's an interesting thought. I don't quite know what to say about it. I think redesigning Protoss to make it more rounded like Terran and Zerg sounds like a very difficult task, and I think in the current setup that balance is being done, it is something that I find very difficult to imagine happening. And people have been talking about this for years, of course, as well. Yeah, interesting. I don't know. It's so hard. God, life is difficult. Everything's so complex. Wish things were easier. Okay, a little bit of comic relief here. the, the community balance team. Then you have all the winners of the major tournaments this year. We have what? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 Zerg players. Then Hero. Home Story Cup got won by a Zerg player as well. Then we have Intellect Streamers Katowice. I really like that. For whatever reason, people on Reddit keep attacking Scarlet for being like the big magician behind the scenes who's blackmailing people into agreeing with her on Zerg changes, Zerg favor changes. I don't think that's really true. Scarlet is the main person that was implementing all the changes and had the deepest knowledge out of any of the players, or actually the real interactions in the engine. So she was like our main talking point when it was like, hey, imagine we want to implement change X. Like, what are our possibilities to implement that change? And then she thought like, okay, we can change damage point, we can do this, we can do that, we can do scan range or whatever. Just she knows very well how the engine works, and of course she doesn't know it perfectly, so there's a learning process there as well. But yeah, I don't know, I thought it was quite funny. I like this meme. Whenever people are crapping on Zerg players in general, I think that's a good meme. All right, then a question I think we've gotten a lot. There's been a lot of analysis on the new patch, but how did we not get a change on the Queen? This isn't supposed to be a balance wine, but no changes to the Queen blows my mind. It's the best defensive unit in the game. That's fine, as Zerg doesn't have many other options. However, it has 1,000,000 HP, is weak to nothing, and has hundreds of energy. On top of that, it has other ramifications to the rest of the game, namely that losing creep tumors doesn't matter because you've built so many that you can just replace those same tumors with live ones on the edge of what's just been killed. Then even if you're optimally placing tumors, you have so much spare energy that these 150 mineral units can heal each other, other units and buildings with the hundreds of energy they have to spare. How does the Queen get such a free pass? That's actually a good question. And I think the main reason is because everyone is really afraid of touching the Queens. And this might just be a bad thing. I'm sure that you could make minor tweaks to a Queen without completely breaking the game. You could make it have slightly less HP. You could make it have, make the transfuse 75 energy. There's a lot of things you could tweak, but almost all of these minor tweaks could have really big implications in how the early game plays out. And touching the early game that matters in every single matchup, I think is just a very scary prospect, so close before the World Championships at Intel Extreme Masters Katowice. I think that is the main reason. I'm not sure if this is a good enough reason not to touch the Queen, because trip __. It is fair. The Queen is a very, very good unit and basically possesses too much power in the Zerg army and in the Zerg entire early game. Like, the entire early game hinges on one unit. I don't think that is very good. And I also don't think it's a very fun unit to see. Way too much HP. The fact that they can heal each other is kind of lame as well. So yeah, I'd like to see changes there as well in the future. I agree with Trip for sure. All right, what do we have more? Lurkers should also get nerfed. This is my favorite thread, I think, by several Harstem video 2847. If you nerf disruptors and ghosts, you should also nerf the lurker. Otherwise, Zerg will just have easier transition into late game, in which they are better next patch. Anyways, thoughts? ? And then a smiley face. So I think several video knew that this was going to absolutely blow it up, and you see 255 comments, 195 upvotes. This type of ratio is beautiful for some spicy threats. I don't necessarily think that just because you nerf something somewhere, you should be nerfing a unit that possesses a similar role in the other race as well. I think the Ghost and Disruptors were slightly more problematic at a higher level than Lurkers are. I don't think that is incorrect. I think the way Disruptors function, especially in the PvT matchup, I am not a huge fan of personally. I'm not saying it's imbalanced. I'm saying that I'm not a fan of that the entire Protoss late game hinges on the Disruptor getting good shots. Really just lacking that backbone that we talked about earlier. the entire TVC late game, and basically a lot of TVP as well, kind of hinges on the Ghost. In TVP, you need them for EMPs, and they're very easy to use. And in TVZ, it hinges on the snipe, basically just hitting the entire army. I think the Lurker is a little bit different, is that it's... In TVZ, it's a very good unit, don't get me wrong, but we've pretty much gone past the times of seeing 25 Lurkers and straight up winning the game, moving across the map. I feel like Terrans have gotten a lot better at that, of dealing with those. Now, of course, with Snipe being nerfed, there is a risk that the Lurker becomes too strong, and in that case, I think a Lurker nerf definitely could be in order. In the current iteration of the game, I think it's too weak against Protoss, or it's weak against Protoss. It's a transitional unit into a late game composition, and not much else. And it's a very expensive transitional unit as well, may I add. And against Terran, it has the potential to end games. I don't know. I just don't feel like the Lurker is that huge of an issue, personally. But I think a lot of people that are slightly below the highest level really, really struggle against the Lurker. And that is something that maybe we should keep in mind a little bit more. It's really difficult to do all of this, though. Like I think in general it should be balanced around high level play, and then the gameplay should be fun for lower level players as well, but not so much caring about the balance. I think that is the main philosophy in my mind that would be the best. And maybe in this case we're kind of missing the fun in the lower level leagues, as Ghosts are kind of difficult to use in the lower level leagues, and Lurkers seem to absolutely destroy everyone there when I listen to lower level Terran players. So yeah, it's definitely something to keep in mind. But yeah, I find this very complex. I don't know. Tricky question. Good points, but yeah. Then this one, Balance Team explains how making High Templar the second slowest ground unit instead of the slowest ground unit is a huge buff. That was a good meme as well. I saw a lot more memes, but I couldn't find them anymore this morning when I was making this, preparing for this video. And here the question about the Raven rework. Trying to find as much info and videos I can find, but there isn't much discussion on the Raven rework. I put rework in quotes as it's a hard nerf in Raven late game usage, while a big buff in early game usage, as its abilities are nerfed quite dramatically, like Seeker and Interference, while being faster to build, and cheaper meaning faster Raven by a lot. So I think this is actually kind of a nerf in TVT in a way. And once again, I think the analysis here is kind of okay. I think it's a slight buff in the early game. You get it faster, it's cheaper, and your initial spells are still there. Of course, Interference Matrix did just straight up get nerfed. And in the late game, massing Ravens is a little bit less good. But the only matchup where we saw mass Ravens was in TVT. And Terrans complained about this a lot, that the Raven was simply too strong in TVT. So yeah, that's the reason why we have the Raven rework, really, is in my mind for TVT, and to make it slightly easier to not die to DTs, and maybe use it as a tool to deny creep spread as well. That really is it. I don't know. I think it's one of the changes that I'm really, really fond of, the entire Raven little rework. So yeah, I don't know. I think this is good. Maybe I'm completely wrong, and Lin Mizang, who posted this 2 days ago, is going to be right. We'll come back to this in a couple of weeks, or in a month and a half or so, after the patch has truly gone live. And that's it. Would you look at that? Went through all the tabs that I had open. If there is anything you feel like I've missed, then be sure to let me know as well. I'm curious about it, because yeah, I feel like I covered most of the criticism. I tried to read some of my YouTube comments, but most of them were either just attacks on my personality, which aren't super interesting to address, or they were just happy that there was a patch in general, which also isn't super interesting to address. And I saw some good discussions on Reddit, so I decided to cover these. I hope you did enjoy this video. Once again, if you have any questions, feel free to throw them in the comments. I might respond to a couple of them, and otherwise maybe in a future video. Yeah, that's going to be it for me today. Thanks all so much for watching. I hope you did enjoy this. And if you all would like to see a bit more of this, like me reacting to either stuff that's happening on Reddit, or even on the, God forbid, the Battle.net forums, or just any type of like more meta-y discussions, maybe I could even get some people on for that, almost like a talk show, or even worse, a podcast. yeah, be sure to tell me, and I'll consider setting up. Thank you so much for your time. Thank you for watching, and enjoy all your holidays. Bye-bye. Merry Christmas, and a Happy New Year.